Okay. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but I am planning on finishing our study of Abram today and starting a study of Abraham. You probably all see what I did there just now. We're going to finish up chapter 16 today. We didn't quite finish it last week. Chapter 16, at the start of that, we see, Sarai is, she's been mentioned before, but now she kind of gets a more central role here for not necessarily the first time, but for the first time in a while. And she basically says to Abram, hey, I'm pretty old. I'm probably not going to bear you any children. Take my handmaid, my slave, my servant, whatever your translation uses. Take Hagar. It's an Egyptian slave that she had in her service. And, lay with her and have children through her. That's the plan that she came up with. And Hagar does conceive. And Hagar treats, she kind of looks down on Sarai because Sarai is not able to have children. And so Hagar is suddenly at a higher position than she had been. And Sarai is not happy about this. And she kind of blames it on Abram, even though this was her idea. This is what she wanted to happen. But I guess she didn't think this all the way through of how this was actually going to go. And he says, do whatever you think is right. So Sarai mistreats Hagar. Again, we don't get really any detail about what that may entail. But it was bad enough that Hagar decides to leave. And that is a dangerous situation to leave on your own. She's pregnant, no one around to help her. She's going through the wilderness. That is not a good situation to be in, but in her mind, that was better than staying in that position with Sarai mistreating her. So whatever it was really bad. And then we got to, we didn't quite get to kind of that whole final interaction and what Hagar does there. So we're going to pick up there. Someone read for us Genesis chapter 16, verses 7 through 16, 7 through the end of the chapter.
Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. The angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all of his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roy. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram.
All right, thank you. So we get this kind of second half of this chapter here, and Hagar is out on her own, and the angel of the Lord comes to her, and I'm not going to make, as easy as it would be in verse 8 to make a Cotton Eye Joe reference, because he says, where have you come from, where are you going? But she says, I'm running away from Sarai, but she doesn't say where she's going, which in my mind says she doesn't really know. She doesn't have a plan. She's just trying to get away from Sarah. She's just trying to get out of that situation. She doesn't have a plan. Things are not good for her. And the angel promises her good things. She's, you have a child right now. You're to go back, and that child is going to be born. He's going to be named Ishmael, and he's going to have great descendants. You're going to have great descendants. And we're going to, of course, find out it's going to be even clearer in the next chapter that Ishmael is not the son of promise. That the covenant that God is having with Abraham. But even despite that, Ishmael is not going to be left behind. In fact, Hagar really sees that the Lord is noticing my situation here. He's taking note of it. He's not ignoring me. So Hagar seems to very much appreciate what God is doing here. So that's a really interesting thing to look at. Now, one of the things I do want to mention about Ishmael, talks about him kind of being in hostility toward his brothers. And this is mentioned again later in Genesis. Let's go to Genesis 25. I'm going to skip ahead. Genesis 25 is a section, I believe, that's after the death of Abraham. So we may reference it, but we're probably not going to get too deep into that section of Genesis afterwards. So I figure we'll do it again. Because in chapter 25, it's going to talk more about Ishmael and his descendants. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Can someone read for us Genesis chapter 25? Let's just do verses 17 and 18, please.
These were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt, as you go toward Assyria. He died in the presence of all his brethren.
Interesting. So the end of verse 18, my translation says, and they lived in hostility toward all their brothers. So interesting. Any other different translations or wordings on that final part of 18? Verse 18, the end of it, the last sentence. Anything someone has different there? Opposition. Defiance. Okay. So your translations are going to vary a little bit, and I do have a footnote in my translation that some of them will say they lived east of, and it just gives kind of a geographical positioning. I'm not sure why there seems to be a lot of difference between translators on what the wording should be here, because some of them would mean very different things. Some would mean, oh, you're just to this area of certain people, or you're in this state of combativeness with these people. And I'm not sure why there's difference between translations. I'm not a linguist. I don't know enough about it, but it is interesting to see. But if you take the hostility translation, that basically mirrors what we see here back in Genesis chapter 16 about, he's going to kind of have some issues with some of his brothers. There's going to be conflict, if you will. I do want to also note, and we'll probably talk about this later again, if you go through Ishmael's descendants, you're going to find that he has 12 sons and 1 daughter, which is really interesting because if you look at the descendants of Jacob, who would also be known as Israel, he has 12 sons and 1 daughter. So there's almost this mirror. I mean, there's a couple generations off, but you have this kind of mirroring of Ishmael didn't have the promise that Isaac had, but he was given still something pretty significant. And there are many groups in the area of Arabia that will tie themselves to Ishmael. They'll claim their descendancy from Ishmael, which would then tie them to Abraham. So there is very much this idea of kin there going on, which has not really solved anything in the Middle East. I won't get into that. But it is an interesting thing to note. It's very, very kind of interesting. Do you have a hand up?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The descendants like of Noah. I go through this, and this was only not very many years ago that I really dug into it. But you see a lot of the names that they put "ite" on the end of it, and you see them. Do we see anywhere? Does anybody know in the Bible after this any of those names show up?
I haven't done a deep dive on these descendants of Ishmael. I know that his daughter is said to become one of, I think, the 3rd wife of Esau. But she has a different name. I think they use 2 different names in that case. So if you're looking for the same name, I don't think it shows up the same way. But it does say in Esau, because he had 2 Canaanite wives whom that his parents despised or were displeased with. And so he decides to marry the daughter of Ishmael and to somehow solve that problem. I'm not sure how that is supposed to solve that, but that's not here or there. But that does come up. But I don't think we really see by name any of the others, at least not that I haven't dived into it. It'd be a good study. But no, I haven't for sure. But I can pretty much assure you that his descendants do continue on to this day. I don't have any doubt of that. But I I haven't looked their names up in the Bible to see if they're mentioned ever again.
That's interesting because I had read somewhere, this is one person writing it, but that a lot of them, they went into the Sinai Peninsula and it wasn't great land.
Right.
It didn't have a lot, and the majority of them died.
There
Are people who negate that, or try to negate that connection with Muslims.
a lot of the tribes you'll see, on the Saudi Peninsula and the Sinai Peninsula are nomadic, or at least were traditionally. And so you wouldn't be in one place for a long time. You wouldn't create a farming settlement. You would travel around from one place to another. You might, be traders, merchants, or you'd be mining, like we know. That Edom, the descendants of Esau, their land was not exactly the best for farming, but it was great for mining, salt deposits, things like that, things that were also valuable in other ways. So I don't, and this is my opinion, I guess. I don't have anything to base it on. In my opinion, Ishmael's descendants did go on. I don't have any indication that they died out. That would seem to be kind of almost I don't know. That wouldn't make sense to me historically, that they would just kind of disappear. Although, as we know, people move around, conquered, and are conquering. So I can't say for sure. But with so many, groups from Yemen, Saudi Arabia, the Sinai Peninsula that claim Ishmael as an ancestor, I kind of trust them on it a little bit. They even know better than I. But yeah, I don't really have much more to say to that. I haven't done a deep dive in that study. But I just think it is really interesting that you have the 12 sons of Jacob and his one daughter, and Ishmael has the exact same amount, like the 12 sons and a daughter. And I don't think that's a mistake. That seems to be a very interesting detail that's put in there. But yeah, aside from Ishmael's daughter, I'm not sure if any of them are ever mentioned, but I haven't looked, so I could be wrong. So that might have to be something I'm going to study because it's going to bother me now. Thanks a lot. Okay. So with that, Hagar, we do see at the end of this chapter, she seems to go back to Abram. That seems to be the indication there. She returns to him, and she bears him a son who's named Ishmael. And we're told when Ishmael was born, Abram is 86 years old. This would make Sarai about 76 years old, because we know she's about 10 years younger than him. So that kind of gives us a time check on his age. So he's 86 and first-time father. So y'all can think about that a little bit. I don't think I'd have the energy for that at that point. It seems like a little much.
Yeah, well, the dad probably didn't do as much.
What? Well, actually, we're going to get into that a little bit. I have some opinions about Abraham as a father, but we'll get into that kind of in the later chapters. Any comments on, I don't really have much more to say on chapter 16. It's just kind of a narrative giving us, the origins of Ishmael. He is an important figure. It's not like he's a footnote. He does need to be mentioned because the New Testament will make comparisons between Ishmael and Isaac later on. We may get into those a little bit in the coming chapters, but it's something that is brought in here and is included in here for a reason. But it's a pretty simple narrative otherwise.
We don't have a lot, do we, anywhere that says what the behavioral characteristics of Ishmael?
Well, we do a little bit, and when he's still young. There's kind of an incident that comes up later on in one of the chapters between, I guess, him concerning Isaac and his disposition toward him, if you will. It's not like super detailed, and it's kind of a blip. So we don't really know when he grows up what he becomes. But I will say, and we're going to skip ahead again. If you go back to Genesis chapter 25, when it talks about the death of Abraham, you will notice that it's not just Isaac who is there to bury him, Ishmael is there too. So there is at least not enough hostility between them that they can put their differences aside to bury their father, which you don't always see in some families that are broken up and not getting along. Sometimes they won't even gather for a funeral, to pay their respects kind of thing. So they do have kind of a one last meeting that we see at that point. In Genesis chapter 25. Again, a very brief mention, but we do know that it's verse 9 of chapter 25, that both Isaac and Ishmael are there to bury Abraham. Spoilers, I'm skipping ahead, but it's a good question. So and then we have the details about his descendants later on in that chapter. That's really all we see except for his daughter being married to Esau later on. That's about all I can remember off the top of my head that we see of his descendants by name. Not that they're not around, it's just that's kind of the main.
Quick question.
Sure.
Is they throughout this, they keep incredible genealogy. Now, that was even before Abraham, right? Or when did they start doing all that? And so the two things I've always kind of thought about is, well, when you get taken into captivity, you don't do as much scriptural reading, maybe after a few generations or whatever. But also that, you're not going to keep as good records.
So from the way I understand it is this would be oral tradition at this time. It wouldn't necessarily be written down. But during probably the time of Moses, it would have been written down.
Right.
That's most linguistic, Bible scholars will pretty much point to that era as when stuff started getting written down. But it would be passed down orally. You'd say, you're the son of so-and-so who's the son of so-and-so and the son of so-and-so. And it would be something that would be memorized and something that would be well known. We don't consider that typically good record because when a person dies, that record's gone. And if they didn't pass it down, well, then it's lost. But that's when you would have these things start to be written down. And we did, and this was several years ago now, I think, when we did a Genesis 10 study, and we have all these, this big genealogy of the descendants of Noah's sons, and a lot of them we don't ever see again in the Bible. But if we look at, history, extra biblical sources, we see they're around. They're just not recorded in the Bible because typically the Old Testament, and this is kind of a rule of thumb, there are exceptions, of course, but the rule of thumb is in the Old Testament, most of the Old Testament is based around the lineage that gets you to Christ because that's building up to Christ. So all the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his 12 sons, Judah especially, and the important one there, because he's the lineage of the kings of Judah. And then you have, when you get to the New Testament, if you look at Matthew and Luke, Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 3, it goes through the lineage to get to Christ. After that point in the Bible, lineage is not really an important thing. You might get, so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, but they may say that just to differentiate between people because there's a lot of people named Judas or a lot of people named, whatever. There's a lot of Marys, and they'll say, daughter or son of so-and-so to make sure that it's that one and not this one over here. It's less important of lineage, and I'm going to get off on a tangent a little bit. The New Testament, and we'll talk about this probably a little bit later too, makes a lot less importance about lineage because it's not about, are you under the law? Are you under the covenant of circumcision? Are you one of Abraham's descendants? It's about, do you serve God? Like, full stop. That's it. Do you serve God? Are you faithful? Do you try to do what's right? Those are the things that matter. We'll actually talk about that when we get to chapter 17.
What I was kind of getting at was, obviously, through Isaac, you've got all of that, especially with Jacob and whatever. But that's got to be oral to written, but we don't know if Ishmael descendants even kept any records. We don't have any.
Well, the traditions of the modern tribes or modern nations, if you will, of that region will claim it. Now, whether or not they can recite for you every single step of that lineage, I don't know. I don't know of anyone who necessarily has done that, but I don't really know anybody from there. But that doesn't mean they don't have that or they don't claim it. But it may not be as clean and exact as what we see in like Matthew chapter 1 or Luke chapter 3, where it makes it very, very clear that Jesus was in the descendancy of David, because that's important for fulfilling prophecy. Was a descendant of Judah, because that's very important for prophecy. Was a descendant of Abraham, because it's very important for prophecy reasons. Those bloodlines, if you will, in my mind, are not important because of who you are, who your ancestor was, is an important thing in the eyes of God. It was to show that God was fulfilling prophecy. And because we see all these things mentioned, and as early as Genesis, where Jesus is being alluded to way, way ahead of time. In fact, when we get to the very end of Genesis, where it talks about Jacob's blessing on his son Judah, it gives pretty clear indication about the coming Messiah coming through Judah. Like, you can't really interpret it any other way. Now, if Jesus doesn't come through that tribe, then God never fulfills that promise. So there's reasons why that genealogy specifically is laid out for us. That's for us to understand that God fulfilled his promises, and we can continue to trust that he's going to be faithful. After that, or beyond that, it's not important. And again, it's because, do you serve God? Are you faithful? Not who's your ancestor, who are your people. This is, I don't know if this is something that a lot of people have difficulty with, because certainly that issue is around still. But a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on genealogy when it's not really an issue anymore. That's been fulfilled through Christ. I mean, I've done family tree stuff. It's interesting. It's cool to find out, like, hey, where did I come from? But it doesn't affect my relationship with God. Or it shouldn't. If it does, then I've got another problem. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
You know, like I said, I was just looking to see if anybody knew if there was any, not scripture, but written documentation of Ishmael's line.
There may be extra biblical texts. I'm just not familiar with any. But that's a little outside of my scope. I wouldn't be an expert on that anyway. I try not to claim mastery of things I don't have. Okay. Any other comments on chapter 16? Go ahead, Jeff.
God blessed Ishmael. You remember, he promised Abraham, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. We have no, we've seen everything we know about Ishmael was that he was not a rebellious son to Abraham, so God blessed him. We see also Laban blessed because of Jacob's association. And I think there's some other instances in the Bible too where that happens. I think it could happen to us, whether it's through the answered prayer or through the setting a good example. If we are righteous, we are the best chance for our loved ones. And that may be true in many other ways too, but it's something for us to think about. And not only are we trying to save our souls, we're trying to give the best possible opportunity for our loved ones to see the Lord, turn to the Lord.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of that. Joseph, when he's in Potiphar's house, or when he's in prison even, like, the prison warden's like, hey, I'm just going to put you in charge. You are a very trustworthy man. Go ahead and take care of things for me. Or Daniel, the whole story of Daniel is like that. Through multiple kings, he's looked upon and called upon and say, like, hey, please take this high position and do this work for us. So, yeah, absolutely. We see that happen constantly throughout Scripture.
People who are associated with righteous people are blessed.
Yeah, there is, and yeah, we can't always explain why that may be, but there can be some practical reasons as they see a good example, or the person who's really doing the job is just going to benefit everyone who's around them in general. It can be the answer. It can be a lot of things. Yeah, and it can be providence. It could be, I can't name all the situations and how they work out, but yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about Ishmael and his kind of his relationship to Abraham as we get on, especially when we get to when Isaac is born. We kind of have to address it because we don't get a lot, but we get these snippets, if you will, as early as chapter 17, even before Isaac is born, about what Abraham's relationship to Ishmael is, and I think it's a really interesting thing to look at, but we'll certainly talk about that in a little while. I don't really have much, because he's just been born. I don't have much to say at this point. All right, anything else on chapter 16? Okay, let's go ahead and start chapter 17. We are not going to finish. I'm just going to let you know that off the top. But we can probably get part of the way through. Someone read for us Genesis 17, just the first two verses 1 and 2, please.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. Now I make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you
Okay, so verse 2, it's kind of more of what we've heard before. You're going to be a great nation. You're going to have a great number of descendants. You won't be able to count them. The thing I really want to point out is verse 1 here. If you look back to the previous verse, chapter 16, chapter 16, verse 16, it says that Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. Now, chapter 17, verse 1, it says when Abram was 99 years old. So 13 years have passed between chapter 16 and chapter 17. Now, it's nice that we get a little time check here and we know exactly how much time has passed, but that's a lot of time to pass in between chapters and just like nothing is mentioned. Like what was happening for 13 years? We don't know. We have absolutely no information about that. But it seems nothing significant has changed, at least. There hasn't been anything really developing as far as God's relationship with Abram or anything that's going on with Ishmael that seems to be of note. In fact, he's around, but there hasn't been any shakeups, if you will. 13 years have passed of just him living, him doing his thing. Nothing seems to have happened. I don't really know much more to say about that. I'm just going to say it's nice to know what age he is because it lets us know how much time has passed. But he's 99 years old now. So you thought he was old when he had a son. He's 99 now. Just think of that. And now he's got a teenager to deal with because that would make Ishmael 13. So imagine being 99 and having to deal with a teenager. There you go.
God didn't tell him, you're 99, and so you're nearing the end of your life. You need to go into retirement. He said, be blameless, continue on. And he's reminding Abraham again. He seems to do this every now and then. I forgot about you.
Yeah.
Got the promises.
13 years have gone by, but yeah.
Everything's moving along according to plan. Just be patient.
And, if I were to skip ahead to chapter 25 again, we're seeing that Abram has a lot of life still ahead of him. Even though he's considered old at this time, he'd be considered old now, especially, but he was considered old at that time, but he has a lot of life left. It's not like he's near the end of his life or anything like that. But in his mind, he's too old to have kids. But we're going to find out that's not going to be the case. Let's go on. Someone read for us verses 3 through 8, please. 3 through 8.
And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God.
Okay. So there is going to be, I have several things to say about this. First of all, he's no longer going to be called Abram. We can finally start calling him Abraham. So we made it. We got through that. We can call him Abraham now. In fact, when you go through this chapter, as soon as he says you're going to be called Abraham now, it just starts referring to him as Abraham, like right off. There's not like, a transition period or still being referred to back as Abram. It's always Abraham from this point on, which is interesting because we don't see that for Jacob. When Jacob is told by God, you're going to be known as Israel now, he still gets called Jacob almost all the time. Rarely is he ever actually called Israel. I don't know why that difference is, but it is interesting. Like right away, it's Abraham. It's no longer Abram. So that's a great transition for us.
Maybe Abraham was a name change and Israel was a name addition.
It could be. Again, I haven't really looked into it. I don't know enough to know why one gets called Abraham and is known that way. But even now, when we talk about people in the Bible, we rarely refer to Israel the person. We say Jacob the person. We say Israel the nation. But his name did change. Like we do have that in Scripture. So just, I don't know, a side note, an interesting observation, if you will. But he calls him Abraham because he's going to be the father of many. And many of your Bibles may have a footnote saying that it's believed that name means father of many or something to that effect. So he's not just going to be, you're going to have the son Ishmael, and maybe you might have a small line of descendants. No, it's going to be bigger than that. And we've talked about already. We've mentioned that he's going to have a lot of descendants. God was really right when he said it's going to be too numerous to count. I'm not even going to try to do that either. That would be a pointless endeavor. But he's going to have a lot of descendants. And God is starting to refer to a covenant with Abraham. It feels so good to say it that instead of Abram now. It's easier. He talks about a covenant with Abraham, and he promises the land of Canaan. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen this, and he said, this would be an everlasting possession for them, to have the land of Canaan. Now, any of you who were in our Daniel study knows that they were not always there, and we also talked about in that Daniel study, even after they came back from captivity in Babylon, when the Romans came to destroy Jerusalem, that was kind of it. And then about modern Israel, I don't think that's a productive discussion. You can talk with me on that on your own time if you'd like. I've got several opinions on that. But what I want to do is look at a couple of verses that give, I don't want to say modifiers, but what's the word I want to use? There are some responsibilities, if you will, that the Israelites will have, Abraham's descendants will have, in being able to keep that land. Let's go to a couple places. I want to look at Deuteronomy chapter 28 is the first one. Now I've only got two sets of verses we're going to look at, but obviously there are more. I think these are just the most obvious and the clearest. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 28, just for some context, the first half of Deuteronomy chapter 8 is God's list of blessings for the Israelites if they keep his commands, if they're faithful to him, all the good things that will follow. And then the second part of that chapter is all the bad things that will happen to them if they don't follow God, if they abandon him, if they go after idolatry and wickedness, what's going to happen. So let's read just Deuteronomy 28, verse 62 through 65. Aren't you glad we're not reading the whole thing? Somebody read 62 through 65, please.
You shall be left few in number, whereas you were, as the stars of heaven in multitude, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God. And it shall be that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and bring you to nothing. And you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess.
Through 65, please.
Then the Lord will scatter you among all people, from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. And among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, falling eyes, and anguish of soul.
Okay. There's a lot more to this chapter that is really dark and really sad and depressing stuff that would happen to them. And we do see happen to them because they do abandon God. And so he's telling them here in Deuteronomy, you're about to go in this land. And, if you keep my commandments, if you keep following me, if you're still faithful, you're going to have all these great things. And you get to this second half, and especially this portion, we read, if you don't do that, if you abandon me, if you go after wickedness, if you go on your own, you who are as numerous as the stars in the sky, an allusion that, a metaphor that God said to Abram, you're going to be destroyed. Even though you're so great, you're so numerous, I can destroy you as well. I'll take you out of the land. I'll uproot you. I'll scatter you among the nations. You'll not have that land anymore. So even though here in Genesis chapter 17, God is giving this promise, and they do get that land, God told him in Deuteronomy 28, if you don't continue in faithfulness to me, you're not going to stay there. Just because you're a descendant of Abraham does not make you more righteous or give you exceptions or exemptions from faithfulness to God. So we see that definitely there in Deuteronomy 28. The other one I want to look at is 1 Kings chapter 9. We'll turn over there and read just a few verses out of there. 1 Kings chapter 9. And this is just as Solomon has built the temple here. That's kind of the history portion that we're in. Someone read 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, please.
When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all the commands and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and respect this temple I have consecrated, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping other gods. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them.
Okay, so we see kind of this description about this disaster also used in the end of 2 Kings, the end of Jeremiah, that people who are not Israelites who pass by and say, like, what happened to these people? Others are going to know why. They're going to know. They're going to say it's because they rejected the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt. So it's not going to be this unknown thing. It's going to be very clear to the people around what happened. But the thing I want to point out here is in verse 5, there's this promise that, the descendants of David are going to be on this throne forever. Then verse 6, but if, the descendants, if you or your son, Solomon, decide to serve other gods and worship them, I'm going to cut you all off from the land. And he goes through all this stuff about, even though there's this temple here, if you go off and serve other gods, it's not going to do you any good, which I think is a really interesting piece of verses for those in Jeremiah's time who are saying, well, God is never going to do these things and destroy Jerusalem because, look, the temple of the Lord is here. He wouldn't do that. Like, did they not read what he said to Solomon right here? Like, surely they would have this record. And it's baffling that they would think that somehow that God was going to make this exception, even though God's very clear, both here and in Deuteronomy 28, that if you go and you do your own thing and you're not faithful to me anymore, you're not going to stay in the land. So you wonder what they were thinking at the time. I can only guess. But God makes it very clear what he will do, what his plans are. It's never a surprise. I don't know why we think that somehow God is tricking us or something. He's very clear. Like, he's telegraphing this for us very well. There's no question about what God's will is here. Any comments or anything up to that? But we're pretty much out of time. We'll stop there. Anything up to verse 8 of Genesis 17? Go ahead, Jeff.
Just that human beings have a propensity to see the Bible the way they want to see it. And it is amazing the degree to which the most devout people can look at Scriptures and convince themselves, delude themselves into thinking it means something it doesn't. And the New Testament has a lot to say about not deceiving yourself. And that's a great thing that we need to be careful of ourselves.
And that's a great point. It's not like we are any different from Jeremiah's time. There are plenty of people who will claim that they are Christians. They will claim they are followers of Christ. And they'll have certain practices or certain ideas. And you can go to the Scripture and show them and says, well, it says this here. How can you justify this? And they may say, well, the times are different now. Or, that's not how it should be interpreted. Or, God didn't really mean that. Or it was only for those people at that time. There will be all sorts of excuses or logical leaps that they'll have to make. But you could just say, but it says this though. Like, just kind of like, I guess, the people in Jeremiah's time who could have looked at what God said to Solomon and would have noticed that, hey, maybe this temple is not going to be the thing that saves us from captivity. It's a mind I can't really understand. It's challenging, but it's certainly pervasive, which is, I guess, why that's so distressing, is because it's so common. Because people, we want to do what we want to do, right? We don't want to have to do this. I don't really want to do that. I don't feel like it, or that's not my thing. I want to do this instead. And that's, I guess, a lot of the story of the Bible is man trying to find their own way and just failing completely every time. But certainly a good point. You're just going to make me end on a depressing note here. Can't be helped, I guess. We're going to stop there, though. We'll continue on verse 9 of chapter 17 next week. We'll probably finish. I expect to finish chapter 17 next week. And then we're going to get into here, chapters 18 and 19. We're going to start getting into the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. I was kind of wondering whether or not I wanted to go into all of that, because at some point it just kind of follows Lot, and Abraham's kind of off on the side for a bit. But it's this time period. It does have a lot to do with Abraham. There are some things that we do need to talk about. So we will talk about that whole thing, even though Lot will be kind of the central figure for a couple chapters there, because I think it's important to discuss. And especially in relation to Abraham's descendants, there are some things to talk about. So we will go straight through them. We're not going to skip any. But that's the plan going forward. So we'll finish 17 next week, maybe start chapter 18 also next week.